You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 83. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sara Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Sara, early in my ministry, I read a book called The Effective Minister. It was written by a man by the name of Michael Cavanaugh. One of the things I read in that book, I have remembered all these years, and he used an illustration of a violin. He said a violin is a musical instrument that is both sensitive and strong. It's sensitive in that it's affected by the slightest touch, and it's strong because its strings can withstand a great deal of pressure. Then he went on to say a violin must be continually and properly tuned to be played well, because if it's not, he said even the finest violinist cannot call forth beautiful music from an untuned violin. So when I think about leaders, we have to be in tune with ourselves. To touch people in beautiful ways, we ourselves cannot be out of tune with ourselves. If we are out of tune with ourselves, not even the Lord can make music with us. So as I think about it, maybe today our focus would be upon our self-awareness and how we are in tune with ourselves, as we are in tune with Jesus, as we are in tune with the people around us. And I think we would call that the value of integrity.
So before we go any farther, let me remind you that this episode of LeaderCast is brought to you by Dare to Lead, a training experience for Christian leaders to learn the skills you need to be a brave leader and create a courageous culture at church, at home, and in your workplace. It's just one way we're helping you as a leader to transform your relationship with Christ, your congregation, and your local community. You can find resources for this episode at transformingmission.org/083.
So over the last several episodes, we've been talking about recognizing God's presence, celebrating God's presence in difficult times, creating a culture of recognition and celebration. So in these discussions, we have discovered that being aware of God's presence in our own lives is important. So being aware of who we are as God has created us and how we best live out our lives in relationship to one another and the world is revealed in the value of integration. So Sara, I've got a question for you as we start this episode together. When did you first become aware of God's presence in your life?
Well, there's a small question.
Yeah, we wanted to start off with easy ones in this episode.
Well, since we are talking about knowing who you are and living an integrated life, it's a good question, because for me, it's not a moment in time. It was a part of my journey of learning and growth, and really my growth in self-awareness. And that really began when I was doing a master's degree at Miami University in higher ed. And part of that program was around leadership development, and part of that program was around human development. And another part was around organizational cultures and how we create cultures. And so in the leadership piece, believe it or not, was really where I began exploring what we were talking about then is spirituality and leadership. And so I began asking a lot of questions about what does spiritual mean? I could give you a whole litany of things that today I understand differently than I did then. But I think in general, what that season in my life did for me was it prompted me to ask questions and to have conversations with people about the holy, about who is God and what does it mean believe in God, and who is this person that we're talking about in terms of the word and the name and the person of Jesus. And so I don't know that those moments were moments that I was necessarily aware of God's presence, but I was asking questions, seeking God's presence. Probably the place that God's presence really became concrete for me. I could point to lots of different examples, but I don't think I've told this story on the podcast, so I'll tell this one. I was actually in seminary, and we had taken I think they were calling it an intercultural trip at that time, to South Africa. And I will always remember being they called them informal settlements. They were row upon row of lean-tos made of every substance that you could know or come up with off of the streets, out of a garbage heap. So everything from tin to hubcaps to old pieces of furniture were forming homes and forming lean-tos to be shelter for folks. There was no sewage in the area. There was no running water. And yet there were gardens that were providing food for the people that were there. And while I was in that informal settlement, we had an opportunity to be with the children that were attending a preschool. Many of them had been orphaned because of AIDS. And so literally they were wandering around the settlement 2 and 3 years old, orphaned. Yes, alone by themselves. So I'm thinking this is not okay. And being at that point in time, someone who wanted to fix the things that were problems, what's running through my mind is, how can I fix this? Well, I couldn't fix it. I mean, there was no way that I could, but what I could do is be present in that moment. And it was there. I distinctly remember saying to the people that I was traveling with and who were there in that settlement with me, we got in our cars to leave at the end of the day. And I said, I'm not going. I'm not leaving. And they looked at me like, are you too, Sarah? What do you mean you're not going? I said, I can't leave this place. And it was a combination of both seeing the need all around me, but what was really going on is we had given the children what was nutritional taffy. And if you ask me about what's the holiest communion that I have ever experienced, that would be one of the moments. And watching the joy in their lives, and I'm thinking, you don't even have adults in your life to take care of you, and you are overflowing with joy. And we were invited into people's homes. You and I would look at them and say, Sarah, you're calling that a home? It was their home, and they invited us into their homes as guests. And I was standing on holy ground. And I did not want to leave that place. It was the place and moment in my life that when we hear Wesley's story of his heart being strangely warmed, it was in South Africa that I would say my heart was strangely warm, because the questions that I had been asking, the things that I had been doing in terms of reading the scripture and praying and studying the scripture, and yes, enrolling in seminary, those were all good and beautiful things. But standing there on this muddy dirt road outside of these little cars, looking at my classmates and professors and a bishop in South Africa and saying, no, I'm not leaving. And I think it was one of my professors who said, so if we're leaving you here, how are we going to explain that to your family? That got me in the car. Because I didn't want to do that to them or try and explain it. But that would be one moment. Like I said, there have been many, but that was probably one of the first moments that I can truly say I understood and I encountered God in a way that I had not yet experienced in my life.
So would you say there was a convergence of things in your life up to that point that brought you to that kind of experience?
Yeah, it was the questions that I was talking about and I was asking in those moments. It was the experiences that I was having in my everyday life of trying to do this Jesus life and trying to learn it and having conversations and being in worship and helping to lead worship and really being a part of a family that was deeply rooted in the Christian faith. And then having that experience that when people talk about serving in mission, I think part of what ends up happening to us as individuals, and this was not a missions trip, this was truly a learning trip, is that because we're in circumstances and situations that are out of our control and unknown to us, we have to be more open to what's happening all around us. And that was one of those moments that there was nothing, I had no idea where we were going that day. I knew we were going to an informal settlement, and I didn't really even understand what that meant. I knew there was a church that had a preschool there. That's all I knew. And what did I encounter there? But God, in and through the children, in and through the teachers who were leading the preschool, in and through the men and women who called that community home. And it was everything in my life that had led me up to that point. It was as if I was staring it down in that moment, if that makes any sense whatsoever. And it was all there present with me. And Jesus was at the center of it all.
I know my question was, when was the first time you became aware of God's presence? But I need to ask a follow-up question, and that is, has that been the only time that you've experienced God's presence?
Oh, gosh, no. No, I mean, I think last week I wrote a blog about 5 times in 1 week that was happening. It's a question that I seek to ask myself each and every day. And I think part of why I ask the question and why I continue to go back to asking others to ask themselves that question is because once you encounter the presence of God, I don't know how you can not want to be in that place with God and to pay attention to who God is if you call yourself a person of faith. Because it's a place of love, it's a place of compassion, it's a place of understanding, it's a place of beauty, it's a place of chaos. Do you want me to keep going? And in those places, that's where we experience the embrace of God. And there's also the call to continue becoming more. How about you?
I was going to ask you a question before you did that. I'll answer it quickly, or the best way I can. One of the words that I know that you've used in telling your story is that there has been a convergence or a culmination of things that brought you to a place of where you would be able to identify that presence of God. And as I think about my life, as I look back upon it, I think I was born for that, born to experience God's presence. And I can say that because of the experiences that I've had over my life, and then having one certain experience that made sense of all the things that came before that. And that was the idea of being adopted. The day I was told that I had been adopted, I was 24 years old. I'd been a pastor for 4 years. I was already in seminary, and that brought together a whole lot of other kinds of experiences and thoughts and feelings that at that moment it all made sense. But that was just one that happened because when I went on to seminary, there was another one of those, this is what makes sense, and recognizing God's presence. And it's really kind of, now I think about it as kind of foolish, but I think it was fundamental to me understanding God's presence in my life, and that is in a class when I heard the words that finally clicked with me, we're talking about the cross and God's activity on our behalf through Jesus, and the words were used, God's grace precedes our faith. I'm not sure why, up until that point, I had always thought that I had to have enough faith to receive God's forgiveness or God's grace. But at that moment, there was something in that class. I know exactly where I was sitting and the seat that I was in, and the reality at that moment of saying, this is why I exist, is that God has loved me and has something for me to do, and what I do is respond to God's love. That was a very powerful experience. And then later on, a couple of years later, I get to be in Ghana, and I'm on a preaching mission with my professor that actually was teaching in that class. But I think I've shared this with you before. On a Sunday morning, I'd been assigned to go preach in a new church start, and I'm in the back seat of a car with two people sitting in the front who are talking a language I do not know or understand. I'm by myself in the back seat of the car. Those of you who have been to Africa know that our sisters and brothers in Africa, when they drive on roads with ruts that are a foot deep, but they'll go 70 and 80 miles an hour over those ruts. And so I'm thinking, I'm not going to live past this. And the thing that goes through my mind is, if something happens, anybody that knows who I am does not know where I am. And the next thing that came to my mind, I didn't hear a voice, but it was a very real someone speaking to me. You can trust the people you're with. They're my people as well. And again, God's presence. Those kinds of things have added up into my life. I mean, there are many others, but those have added up into my life that it is very evident to me that when I feel like I'm in the presence of God, or I'm seeing God at work, or I'm experiencing Jesus in and through someone, it runs through me, even in a physical kind of way, that I know this is where God, because I hear again, these are my people, and you can trust them.
So for the folks who are listening, you may be listening to our stories and thinking, so Sara, that's a great story. Tim, those are great stories, but what does this have to do with leadership? And I would say to you, if you haven't had the conversations with the people in your congregation that Tim and I just had about God's presence and where they first experienced God's presence, you're likely missing out on a big part of people's story. And you're also missing out on an opportunity to help folks continue to grow in God's grace. That's how we arrived at this episode, because we were asking the question, how do we teach people this? And I think, Tim, you were the one who said to me, well, Sara, when did you first experience God? What was that like for you? And I started reflecting on the fact that questions were being asked in my own life and in my own soul that made me curious about faith and started me on a journey. And if those seeds aren't being planted in people's lives and the questions aren't being asked, I've said it before and I'll say it again, we might have some folks that are participating in church, but you might not be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Because disciples are seeking to follow Jesus. And if we're simply participating in programs in the life of the church, that doesn't always translate to discipleship. Before we ask you to answer, when did you first become aware of God's presence in your life? Here are two questions we want you to think about and reflect upon. because these questions will make it easier for you to answer the bigger question that we've asked. And the first one is what, Tim?
Number one probably was, who are you? You're a child of God. You have thoughts and feelings that are yours. There were things that are necessary for us to come to the place of recognizing God's presence. And one of them is, you're just a child of God.
How do you know that you're a child of God? How does someone come to the place that they understand the simplicity and the profound nature of claiming that statement?
24, when I realized that I'd been adopted, the reality of God's grace came rushing into my life at that moment like it never had before. And then I experienced it in other ways, like, well, God's grace comes before all this other stuff. And then when you have to put it into action, it is, you can trust these people because they're my people too. And the second one is, then who are you as a leader?
So who are you as a leader?
My guess is, you don't have to have it like me, but my guess is you have some sense of purpose or call in your life that you're trying to live out. I am as sure as we're talking that you have strengths and skills and gifts that God has given to you, and that you have relationships with family, friends, neighbors, colleagues. All of those things come together in your life as a human being, but that helps make you a leader, or feeds into who you are as a leader.
So answer that question for yourselves and with the leaders and people around you. When did you first become aware of God's presence in your life? And then it's not just about that one-time experience or even an experience, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Some people believe that following Jesus is a simple matter of inviting him into our hearts. But when we do that, Jesus always asks, "May I bring my friends?" And when we look at them, we see that they are not the kind of company that we like to keep. The friends of Jesus are the outcasts, the marginalized, the poor, the homeless, the rejected, the lepers of life. So we hesitate and ask, "Jesus, must we really have them too?" And Jesus replies, "Love me, love my friends." And that's a quote from Peter's story. It's not about that moment of
Right.
quote unquote inviting Jesus into your heart. It's about the relationships that we're a part of and the people that we encounter and the ways that we live out God's love in our everyday life. That's growing in grace, because you're going to screw it up. And you're going to miss the opportunities, and you're going to feel bad about the opportunities that you said, "I don't feel like it today." Maybe that's just me.
Peter's story, that's a great quote. That's exactly what we need. I remember a conversation with my Aunt Ruby, and I might have been Alexis age, 14, 15 years old, and I'm having difficulty with people who are leaders in the church who smoke cigarettes.
Because that would have been the time.
So, we're having a conversation. She's talking about somebody by the name of Blake, and there's somebody else. And I'm saying, I can't believe that he's a leader, and then goes outside and smokes a cigarette in between the worship services. And she said, "You better be careful, because that's not what it is to be Christian." I took that to mean that it wasn't Christian to smoke a cigarette, not that it wasn't Christian to be passing judgment on the person who was smoking. Now,
you were 14, 15 years old.
So somewhere along the line, there was this funny feeling in my life, and I'm saying a funny feeling because I felt inferior to used car salesmen and to politicians. And I just didn't think that either one of them would ever make it to heaven. And then I became a pastor. And in the congregation, early on were people who sold cars and people who were holding public office. But somewhere in the midst of that, I learned that they were human beings, children of God. God loved them, and I could experience God's love in and through them. So when I hear Peter's story say, and you using that quote, that yes, I invited Jesus in and he brought his friends with him. He brought used car salesmen and politicians with him. He brought people that smoked cigarettes with him.
And who are the people that we end up encountering God through?
The very people that we see that Jesus brings with him.
And that's where, if we're going to talk about living an integrated life and following Jesus in and through that integrated life, don't tell me that Jesus doesn't have a wicked sense of humor.
A difficulty is that regardless of whether it's the kind of tradition of which we've had, we get hung up on there was a time in which God became real to me. A time. So we look for the time that happened. And in reality, it is every day. It is every moment of every day. And I think even Wesley said he tried to be aware of God's presence every 5 minutes.
And isn't that why we talk about growing in grace?
Yes. That's just where it comes down for me when I hear that quote. And Jesus showed up for me one day when a state legislator comes into my office and says, I need to talk with you and I need you to pray with me. Because up to that point, my separation with them, with him particularly, was that why in the world are you even in the church? You have everything you want, who you are, what you do, why in the world would you be here? What do you need?
He needed Jesus.
And he shows up in my office and he asked me to offer him all that I have to offer. And that's Jesus. It's the grace that I've experienced, God's grace that I've experienced, and what he's asking is for me to extend that grace.
So could it be that we know who we are in Christ in and through our interactions with others? That the people around us become a mirror in a way of who God is and who God is inviting us to be.
I like that, and I think that's the reason I've come to the place in my life, right, wrong, or indifferent, where I say I can't be who God's created me to be if I'm not including everyone in my life. So whoever I encounter, whether I like them or not, whether they've hurt me or not, whether I want to or not, they are a part of who makes me who God created me to be.
And I think that's a good place to end this episode. Tim, any last-minute reminders?
Sarah, I really appreciate this conversation because I think it's at the heart and soul of who we are, not only as leaders, but as Christian leaders, as followers of Jesus. So I want to come back to the questions and just ask those who are listening to not only reflect upon the questions, but really begin to live with them to see how they shape their lives. And maybe even use them in some conversations with their leadership in the church. When did you first become aware of God's presence in your life? And the second question, how does God's presence shape who you are and what you do? Those are two questions that will make a difference in your leadership.
And they'll help you integrate who God is and who God is inviting you to be in, how I like to say it, in your everyday, ordinary life. And there are people all around you who are hungering for the love of God that you already know. They may not know it. They may not use that language. But your willingness to be present with others in a place that you are being who God created you to be just might create the space for them to encounter God for the first time. Said differently, you might become a part of someone's God story. So let me remind you as we conclude this episode that you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/083. If you haven't already done so, you can subscribe to LeaderCast on your favorite podcast player. And if you want to join others, you can become a LeaderCast Insider. You'll find links to your favorite podcast player and how to sign up to be an insider at transformingmission.org/083. All that's left to say is go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.